So just would like to welcome everybody. My name is Aaron Iceberg. I'm the director of the Center for Excellence, which is housed at New Technology High School, which is a wall-to-wall PBL school. I'm also national faculty member for PBL Works. I'm here today with author and practitioner Dr. Michael McDowell to discuss his latest book, Teaching for Transfer, which was released earlier today. For those of you that are watching on the live YouTube stream, please feel free to post questions in the chat, and I'll do my best to get your questions answered. If you'd like to know more about the live stream, we're going to go to hingeeducation.org and then also go follow him at Twitter. And I'll put those Twitter links here in the chat as well. So here in the chat, you'll see that you'll have Michael's Twitter handle, Hinge Education, as well as my Twitter handle, Iceberg PBL. So let's get going. Michael, great to see you.
Hey, it's good to see you too, Aaron. Thanks for doing this. I appreciate it.
Not a problem, not a problem. Glad to be on it because I know being and doing PBL for so long, I'm just excited to have a pre-copy of the book to read it. And I was just really taken aback about how different this book reads than other educational books. The stories from popular media, some of my favorite, the novel viewpoints, and really the critiques of innovative methods, right? The innovations that we keep pushing forward in our work. And just really the way you're thinking about rigor and learning, and how does that shifting, especially when we start talking about PBL. So I'm really looking forward to learning more about your book, to try and pick your brain with some of the challenges that I know we face as PBL practitioners, and also to see some of those shifts from the initial draft that I was fortunate enough to read early on, and well as your advice you might give educators as they engage in this work moving forward. So you ready to go?
Let's do it, Aaron. That's great. Great
Awesome.
Intro.
Yeah. All right. So doing well so far. So here's my first question. For those of you who haven't been fortunate enough to read the book, tell us about this Teaching for Transfer. What is this book really all about?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it goes back to a little bit on like my educational journey. So I started as a project-based practitioner, a high school teacher actually at Napa New Tech High School. And my job was to help develop problems and projects for students to engage in science and mathematics. And what I was drawn to by these particular types of methodologies was the empowerment and the engagement, the potential that these methodologies had. I was also really intrigued by the idea of utilizing a methodology that students could learn core content, but then apply it into the real world. But what I found as I was doing this is that there was, I didn't find that students actually did well academically, as well as I would have liked. And I actually found that there was some myths around problem and project-based learning that that precluded me from actually being able to ensure that students learn the core content knowledge and then could apply it. And so I really wrestled with that for several years. I mean, I had coached in PBL classrooms, and I had actually written a book on rigorous PBL by design. But prior to writing that book and my experience as a practitioner, I had the privilege to actually start to dive into a lot of the research. And one particular researcher that really influenced my thinking was Professor John Hattie and his work around visible learning. And he did a synthesis of meta-analyses. It's a study of studies that studied studies. He looked at all of these various studies and he was trying to figure out like, hey, does everything in education work? And what he found is like, well, yeah, pretty much everything works. And then he said, but there are certain things that tend to have more of an effect on student learning. And in some things don't have much of an effect on student learning. And problem and project-based learning was one of those things. It had a really low effect size. It actually equated to about a half a year's growth in 1 year's time. And so I really struggled with this. Like it was this real tension because there was this methodology that I really loved because of the potential that it had. And yet there was this research that said, you know what, it actually doesn't have the proof points that you're actually looking for, Michael. So I thought, well, maybe we need to change some parts of this particular methodology and we need to think about it. But even more, I started to step back and say, what do we mean by rigor? And what does rigor look like? And so I spent a lot of time actually looking at the research around rigor. And what I found is that there was a particular taxonomy that not only did I think was powerful for us to think about learning, but I also thought it was powerful for how kids could talk about learning. So, and that method, that those levels of learning are surface, deep, and transfer. So surface being, I know things, like I can define what a food chain is. I can define a food web. Deep would be really relating ideas. What's the relationship between food chains and food webs? And you start to understand enduring understandings, such as, how energy moves in an ecosystem. And then transfer being, you can actually apply that into the real world. And what I found is that in the research, there are certain things that work really well at transfer, like problem and project-based learning. And then there are certain things that are abysmal at surface and deep, which is project-based learning. And most of Professor Hattie's research in his 2009 study really looked at more surface level learning. And so when he looked at PBL, he said, look, it doesn't have much of an effect, but it really does at that transfer level. And so for me, I was trying to figure out, so what is it about that method and other methods that really enable students to get to that level of transfer, and what precludes them from being able to develop surface and deep? And so the book is really my search for how do we ensure that students can transfer their learning, but not lose the core content knowledge that they need to learn. And the other part about this is that there were just things about transfer that didn't sit right for me. So for example, a lot of people think transfer is skills. Like if I just have the skills to apply to a different situation, because transfer is about it's about being able to see in different situations. Like I can see, like once I understand ecosystems, like I can apply that to a situation with like bringing back sea otters, or removing an invasive species like the ferret in New Zealand, right? And so people think, well, if you have the skills of being able to compare one situation to another, you can transfer. But the challenge is that transfer is not a mile wide and an inch deep. It's really a mile wide, and it's also a mile deep. That you have to have enough knowledge to actually apply from one situation to another. And so the book is really this notion of like, what really is rigor and engagement in rigor, and how do you do it across all three of those levels? Because I think that rigor is the equal intensity and integration of all three of those. It's around surface, deep, and transfer learning. And the last thing I'll say, just kind of about why, is that I really struggle with this dichotomy that we create. We create this dichotomy of like, they need to know facts, or we just need to make things relevant. And teachers have never really bought into that dichotomy. It's either this or this, but they often hear that from others and saying, do I do PBL and then we don't care about the knowledge, or do I do the knowledge and we can't really get to the the innovative particular methodologies? And surface and deep is really that idea of depth. It's really focusing in on a core discipline and saying, I'm going to develop a real core level of understanding. And transfer is that idea of breadth and seeing and range across different experiences. And so I wanted to create a book that said, look, you can do depth and breadth. You can put all these things together, and it can be practical. Like there's actually things you can do in your classroom or on a Zoom call that like you can actually teach transfer. You can actually teach surface and deep, and you're not sacrificing relevance or this notion of developing core content knowledge. So that's kind of the purpose behind it and why I wrote the book.
There's so many things that you said in there that really kind of resonated even with me. But as I'm thinking was like, some of these myths around PBL and just like this idea of transfer. And that we so often, I think we get so hung up on that end product or what that thing looks like that we miss out on some of these earlier foundational learnings. Because I know that, and this is a question I'm going to have for you later on, so don't answer it yet, but I think about like the stakeholders in my community when they want to go to a project-based learning school or a school of innovation, a design thinking school, they go straight to some like, well, my kid's in a group, are they doing all the work? So I think about that rigor. And you mentioned a little bit more about that rigor. So, you talked about surface deep transfer, you need all this, but how is transfer rigorous and how might that apply? Because my wheels are turning now, like our teachers across the world, especially now in the United States, like they're living transfer, right? They're living a contextual change. And so I'm thinking like, how is that with that engagement with the kids? So how is transfer really rigorous for kids? And what should I be thinking about as an educator?
Yeah. So I really like that, that idea of like teachers have to transfer. And so they have to go from one medium to another, right? So they have to go from in-class instruction and then they have to go into distance learning, right? So a Zoom call like this or a hybrid of some sort. And the only way that they can transfer is that they already have a lot of core knowledge and exposure. They know how to teach, right? So it's really a question of like, So how do I take that and apply that into a different medium? And I think there's like three things that I talk about in the book that require transfer. I think the first thing is being able to handle that change, and being able to say, look, I already actually have a lot of core content knowledge that I can bring into a new situation and not feel like, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do. Like there's a huge freak out. Like, I don't know how to teach anymore. Yes, you do. It's a new medium, but you know how to connect with kids, like, yes, we need to look at some bells and whistles, but really the good things that we do in the classroom, we can transfer. So it's sometimes just looking at that other medium and saying, I can see how that connects. And then they have a lot of that surface and deep knowledge. I think the other two skills that I think are really important to transfer is this notion of I can see across different contexts. So teachers have taught in a myriad of different places before with like rain delays or power shutoffs, and they figured out ways to be able to do that in the past. So looking at, well, how have other people done professional learning or training in the past? So looking at like what Google does for their PD or what this organization might do for their PD, that's transfer, it's that breadth, but they possess that level of core content knowledge. And then the third one is engaging with other community members. And we often see teachers, doing that well. So what does this look like in the classroom for students? And what do I mean by rigor at these three levels? So I think, and I want to say this right now, surface and deep are completely different from transfer. So transfer is like an entirely different way of thinking and doing than surface and deep. And so surface and deep would be something like I'm teaching students about what is a fraction, how do you add fractions, would be something like surface. Deep would be, why do we find a common denominator when we add fractions, right? So that's really the surface and deep level knowledge that we're trying to develop and invest. And we have a lot of instructional strategies and things to do around that work. Transfer is not more deep. Transfer is not like give them 1,000 word problems and then that's transfer. Actually, many times word problems are often probably more at that deep level, like solve this problem with one context. Transfer is actually giving students like 2 math problems that require adding fractions. So let's say we're doing one on like adding distance, right? So a child like rides this much of their bike, this fraction of a mile, and another, and you have to add those up. And then in another situation, it might be like you're making pancakes, and so you add enough flour into this, or water or whatever into the measuring cup. And it's not having them solve the problems. That's not transfer. It's actually saying, okay, these are 2 problems. How are these problems similar and how are these problems different? And for them to say, well, the context is different. One is on distance and one is on baking. The similarities is that this actually has to do fundamentally with the application of adding fractions. And so when students can see the core content knowledge and how it applies to different situations, they actually have transfer. Now we might think, well, gosh, that doesn't sound like much, but it has dramatic implications. And people, especially experts who have a lot of surface and deep knowledge, don't do that. They don't have that cognitive flexibility of like, all right, I really know my discipline. How do we go out? And so there was a situation at Stanford University where they took 2 groups of students. They had these were graduate students getting a graduate degree in international relations. And in both situations, they were given the same task. And so the task was this: you are going to advise a democratic country on what to do because there's an autocracy right next to them that looks like they're going to try to annex a part of their country. So you have to come up with a solution in an hour. And so they give one group these contextual clues. They said, so you're going to meet with the president of the United States in the Winston Churchill room. The president's from New York. And it looks like some of the refugees are being taken in boxcars. Then the other classroom, they said, you're going to meet in the Nixon room. The president of the United States comes from Texas, and the refugees are being taken in boats. So an hour later, they come out, and the first group comes out, and they're like, what do you think we should do? And they're like, we should go to war. And then the next group, they're like, what do you think we should do? And they're like, we should find a diplomatic solution. And the reason why they had those solutions and came up with those is because those contextual clues made the group fixate on one situation. So they thought of, in this situation with Winston Churchill and Theodore Roosevelt and boxcars, refugees, they thought of World War II. They thought, well, we should go to war. And then the other group, they thought of Vietnam. Neither group actually stepped outside of the one situation and the content they knew and said, what else do we know out there about international relations? It's not that they didn't have the knowledge. but they didn't have the experience and the examples to actually say it's about breadth. I mean, rigor is really this idea of like, I know my information. Whoa, how does that apply in other real world situations? And this is fundamentally the problem with project and problem-based learning. And though I'm not, in the book, I don't say like you have to use a particular methodology. And I'm pretty agnostic when it comes to instructional methodologies. The real problem with PBL, and there's a myriad of them, but one of the biggest problems with transfer is we only give kids one situation. We say, here's the wolf project, or here's the baking project, or here's the water project. And so what happens is kids focus on water, they focus on baking, they focus on wolves. And what they don't focus on is what else besides wolves would this apply to? What else can I learn? So if you gave students 2 situations or 3 situations, they'd actually be able to see, okay, I can see now how that connects and I can apply this to another situation.
So, again, it's really resonating, living at a PBL school and teaching, projects all throughout is that freeing idea of, right now PBL is really designed around one aspect, like you will solve this one real world problem. I mean, even the planning process organizationally, people said they start off with what's a real world problem you want kids to solve. And then that's it, right? And those contextual clues tend to lead them down the road. And I wonder about that freeing up. And that's always hard to plan as a teacher, right? As a teacher, and if I have multiple periods, if I'm, upper or if I'm lower, like how am I going to manage all these kids? How am I going to manage the process? And now I got to sit through the same presentation a bazillion times. Like, no, thank you. And then we get doubled down on, well, you can do an exhibition night instead, so you don't have to sit through 3 days of presentations. And really, all we're doing is the exact same thing. We're still leading kids down the track. So I'm wondering about how freeing this is at transfer to give kids maybe voice and choice, to do some twist and different lenses for kids. So with that, I'm wondering, where is this myriad? How does this blend with PBL? Does it? Is it oil and water? Is it probably the wrong analogy there? But how do these things come together as well? And how can I leverage this idea of teaching for transfer to improve the work that maybe I'm already doing if I'm already doing projects, and the quotes there are intentional.
Yeah, no, that's great. So I guess the way I would think about it is, so I'm going to just show you a quick slide. Let me just throw this up here. And can you see that, Aaron?
I can, yes, thank you.
Yeah, so I'm gonna, let me get it to the third slide here. So we just talked about this notion of depth and breadth, right? And I'm gonna just scroll through and show you this one. So surface and deep is this idea of learning core content knowledge, and breadth is being able to then apply that into various situations. So the idea of like, if I know my math, if I know enough math, if I know enough science, if I know enough English, I could give students, I could get a problem from my teacher, and then I could apply that into multiple situations. Like if I understand, if I'm looking at the COVID-19 issue, I could say, how does that apply with epidemiology? How does that apply to what we know in the early 1900s from my understanding of the Spanish influenza, or the Spanish flu and World War I? We also could look at mathematics around how we calculate this, right? All of those things. And so the reason I say that I'm agnostic of PBL, if we really do believe that rigor is the equal intensity and integration of these 3 things. I know things, I can relate things, so surface, deep, and I can apply things, transfer. Then we can really say, well, how do I want to lay that out? Like, where do I want to start? Where do I want to finish with students? So if I want to start at surface and then deep and then transfer, that's a very traditional way of approaching instruction, right? So I teach them some things, they relate some things, they apply some things. Like, I'll just kind of go back to my situation with like, here's the food chains and food webs, define those, list those, outline those, let's relate those, what's the enduring understanding, and then give them situations at the end of that, the end of that unit.
Michael, and I don't want to interrupt your thought, but that's an analogy that and correct me if I'm wrong, of doing projects versus PBL, or dessert versus main course. That it would be that pathway of starting at surface, then doing deep, and then letting those to transfer. Okay.
And here's what I'd say. Like, I'm not that I don't really care if it's main course or dessert, as long as you have the right ingredients, right? So what do we do with project-based learning? Well, project-based learning starts at transfer. So it's like, there's trouble in River City, right? Like, here's the huge problem, and everyone's like, and like, this is cool. And then they do like, you do all the, and you let them explore a context. I would argue more than one context. And then you learn the core content and the surface and deep stuff. And then you go back to that level of transfer. So it really has to do with how you want to start instruction with students. So I prefer to start with transfer because I think that is a great way to engage students, but there's also really great arguments for not doing it that way. That's why I'm like, if someone's like, well, I want to do it this way, I'm like, great. As long as students are engaging and trying to create this intersection between all three, I think it's really important. And this is also, and I try to, I wrote it in the book. I hope it is conveyed, is that one of these areas is not more important than any other, right? Like surface isn't more important than transfer. Transfer is not the end all be all. We actually need to get away from this idea of it's like surface and then deep and then transfer. Transfer is an A, deep is a B, and surface is C. It's actually, rigor is really, like I would say, if you have like a 3-point scale, let's just say, and 3 is the top. A 1 would be I know 1 level. A 2 would be I know 2 levels, and a 3 would be I can actually integrate all 3 of them, right? So it's really about how to move that. So when I get to project-based learning, it really is simply the sequence of which I lay these things out, not I have to, everyone has to build a diorama. Right, like, and that's how, that's nuts. And I also think the reason why PBL has this low effect size is that we don't tend to surface and deep well, and we actually don't tend to transfer well because we only give kids one situation, and because of that, they can't transfer. So what we do is they spend all their times on products and processes, like this is how you build things, and this is your group. And then you become like a glorified marriage counselor, like, no, you'll be fine. Let's sign a contract and let's do this. And then the teacher's sitting there going, all I do is process, and I actually don't teach any of the core content. And then at the end, the kids are like, like you said, it's like 50 hours of wolves should be reintroduced because we like wolves. And
right.
here's what Wikipedia says. And it's like, we got to change that and really get back to the learning of this.
So I think about like what you're talking about, and I have a question that popped up in the chat that I want to get to here in a minute. With your, when you think about the process, like there's, organizations and whatnot, they spend so much time on, like, let's say the design thinking process and prototyping. I wonder about, like, if that model or that thinking is like, not that those things are bad or wrong, we can still use that in a lot of processing, but that there's just a lot of skipping of the surface level and basic understanding of concepts like fractions, which is what I'm going to lead into with my next question via the chat.
Yeah. So here's my thing. I think as people become more expert, I think they devalue knowledge, and I think they overemphasize skill. Mm-hmm. So I think when you ask CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, like, what do you want of your employees? There's 2 things that happen. One, they almost always tell you the top 10 skills, and then we rush to like teach kids those skills. And because one, they probably assume like the people that they bring in actually know a lot of core content knowledge. And I also think where there's a little bit of anxiousness that students will not be engaged by learning knowledge, but I actually think it's the flip. I think kids love knowledge. I think they're engaged by knowledge. I don't like to talk about the power of voice in an article or in a book. Like I just finished reading Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. I mean, the power of what he was writing in that. Imagine if I was told, read that book and let's just focus on, the skills of reading. I would not be engaged by that book, and I would lose the love for that. And I also think, Albert Einstein once said, imagination is more important than knowledge. Well, that's easy for him to say. He had tons of knowledge. I mean, he knew so much, right? And so we start to devalue this notion of core content knowledge. And so I think a big part of whatever methodology that we use, when we're looking at our standards, when we're looking at the things we teach, are we privileging knowledge and saying knowledge and disciplines are actually really important, and it is key to transfer. You can't transfer. You can't critically think about something you don't know anything about. And you can't transfer to a new discipline if you don't know anything about that discipline. There was a great example of this, another study where they had students in 2 groups, 3rd graders. One was at the 98th percentile in reading comprehension, and the other was at like the 30th percentile. And they asked both groups to read a 3-sentence paragraph on baseball. And it was like a baseball play, like someone hits the second, the person moves, someone gets out, and someone scores a run. And here's what they found: it did not matter. Oh, and then they asked them to like move figurines on a little baseball diamond. And what they found is that it did not matter what group you were in, the 98th percentile, the 30th percentile. The only thing that mattered is if they actually knew baseball, which makes sense, right? Because if I read, when I go to Australia and they have like the summary for like a cricket game, I have no idea what's going on, right? I see wicket and I'm like, oh, the Star Wars guy, that's cute, right? But I don't know.
The golden duck, the golden goose. I still get them confused. Yeah, I'm still locked into swans. I got you.
And so that's the challenge with this notion, is that we really need to make sure we privilege knowledge and say that in order to use skill, you actually have to have some core knowledge in order to do it.
So I want to come back to this idea, but there's been a question in the chat referring back to your analogy around fractions and how fractions are being used. And the question is would transfer be thinking about addition of decimals compared to adding fractions? What's the same? What's different?
I think that's great. Yeah, totally. I think that could totally be used, because I think that, again, what they're doing is that, I think there's this cross section between deep and transfer, that because you are developing a deeper understanding of why there is that relationship. But if you're only asking students to just compare, like what is actually the similarities and differences between these? Yes, that's transfer. And it's that hard, and it's that I don't want to say simple, but that's all it is. Like, it is about being able to say, here's the difference in these situations. I can see patterns along that. And I think that the more we start giving kids multiple situations to compare and contrast, the easier it is for them to transfer. And I think this also has grave implications or significant implications when students take, whether or not we value the use of assessments or tests. Oftentimes students go on tests and they see the context, right? They're like, I remember when I taught algebra, and it was like two trains coming at one another. We were looking at rate, and we're looking at, distance and over time. And I remember that students got a question on the test on boats, and they were like, you never taught us about boats. I'm like, yeah, I don't have a standard on boats, but it's just, tell me about the problem. They're like, well, there are two boats coming at, and I'm like, it's the same problem. And we look at that and say, how could that happen? But it is simply the issue of transfer. I do want to say one other thing about knowledge, because I think this is an important implication on learning. This is actually why students don't find rubrics that helpful. Because when they don't have enough core content knowledge, rubrics are actually less useful for a student. What they need are models, and they need examples of what you're actually looking for. And so a big part of what I talk about earlier on in the book is, how do you actually build surface and deep level knowledge for students that then is a precursor for transfer? So I talk a lot about show kids multiple examples. Like, if you want students to learn how to write a persuasive essay, show them 6 or 7 great persuasive essays and say, what's similar and different across all of these? And then build out what a rubric would look like with students, so that there's this level of interaction behind that then allows students to not only be completely engaged in what's going on, but also be able to utilize a rubric. As we develop more expertise, we love to create tools that seem to work for us. We're like, this is great. Kids will love this, but we can't take off our expertise hat all the time. And really, when kids look at this, they're like, I need to see an example. I don't know what you're talking about, but if we only show them one example, it prohibits the ability to actually transfer over time. And then what they do is they want to copy that piece, not because they're bad, but because that's
right. Well, because I know early on in my teaching career, like, I was always afraid to show examples because I was afraid kids were going to copy that example. And then, well, there goes the learning, because they just copy my exemplar. And I like what you're saying around showing them multiples and finding the similarities around those, and then helping kind of build out the learning and what a rubric might look like for that. I think that could be a really powerful strategy in that way. So another question came in via the chat. So I'll do this before I want to transition a little bit to your work with Professor Hattie and some of what the research says there. What practical advice do you have for school leaders in applying this work during this time of hybrid or virtual training? I know, just listening to you, like, I already have some answers that I want to just kind of jump right in on this answer, but I'll let you, the expert. What advice would you give to teachers right now who are, I know in the United States and some other areas, who are distance learning or virtual learning or hybrid model?
So a couple things that I would throw out. So I think the first thing is giving students multiple contexts to look at and not just one. So I'll give an example of a problem that I designed that students have engaged in. So I wanted to teach students about environmental racism. So I wanted to integrate two subject areas. I wanted to integrate social studies and to understand civil rights, to understand our Constitution. And I also wanted students to understand some particular issues around habitat fragmentation and destruction. And so the first day, what I had students do is they came onto a Zoom call like this, and I put students into 4 separate groups. So I said, you're going to go in this breakout room, you're going to go in this breakout room, this breakout room, this breakout room. And you can imagine if we were in a classroom, like you go to these groups. And in each one of them, they had a different situation. So one group actually had water pollution, and they had all of these articles and videos to take a look at about lead poisoning in the United States. And then another group looked at food deserts. So in privileged communities, where certain foods, there's more nutritious foods up front in privileged communities and less nourishable foods in the back, but that's flipped in communities that don't have as much access. We looked at another about shipping waste to developing countries, and we looked at climate change and how that affects certain populations. So each group's looking at one situation. And then I bring the students back and I mix them up, right? So it's kind of like a jigsaw. So I'm like, we're going to have one student in each group present to each other on what they just read. And then I ask the students, so what do you think the theme is? What do you think we're learning about? What's the big question that's being drawn from you from this? And that's where I started to get students to say, I can't believe these things are happening. Like, who's responsible? Should we do something about it? To what extent is this happening in my local community? All of these, in project-based learning, we call these driving questions. Often in PBL, we create those, kids don't. Here's a situation where actually kids can create them by showing them just multiple situations. So my one thing is when you show them something, when you want them to learn a piece of core content, give them a couple of different situations. The other thing I would say is just small little subtle changes for students can make a monumental difference. So sometimes you have those learners in your classroom that are, I would call them cruisers. They're high achieving, but low growth. They do really well in one assessment, really well in another assessment, but you don't see much growth in between. What can you do for those learners? And really all they need is just a little bit of a change. They don't need some big project. You don't need to put them into a different room. You don't need to say, well, I'll have to schedule 1 hour for this student. Like really it's about how do you create these little changes for students? And so some examples for that might be, let's say you're looking at a supply and demand curve in economics and you're like, well, here's supply and demand. You just go to that student and say, you have to deal with the, what happened with oil prices in March. Like, how do you handle that? Not everyone else has to do that, just that student. And I know some people will be like, well, that student's going to say that's not fair. And I'd say it's totally fair. It's just not equal. Like what they need is they actually need that kind of growth. And so you could put these little changes or change the context on them. So they were all looking at wolves, and this student, you say, you know what, you're going to look at this golden eagle situation. So I'm going to change the context on you. And it's these types of little changes. So showing them multiple contexts. I also think it's, making these little changes. We call them curveballs, like throwing just a curveball and saying, whoa, I didn't see that coming. It breaks them out of that cruise cycle and allows them to compare, and it allows them to say, whoa, stepping back out and looking outside of myself and saying, okay, now I can see across different situations and what's going on. So those are like just a couple little changes. You could, if you have a rubric and like one of your bullet points is have a conclusion at the end of your paper. If you see students that are done with that, you might go to them and say, I want you to end that with a cliffhanger or a metaphor instead of just having a conclusion. Or I'd like you to write another paper, but I'd like you to change the context. And so you're nudging them into really moving towards that transfer. And some people say that's more work. No, it's different work. It's requiring them to do different work that moves them towards that transfer when they've met some of that surface and deep level content knowledge. So those are just a few little things.
I really like that idea of kind of giving like a cliffhanger at the end, shifting it for some of those cruisers, right? Because we know we all have them in our classrooms, and how we might continually ramp up the rigor. Because I know, like, if you do have those rigor, those cruisers in your class, and you're sitting down for those parent-teacher conferences, the first question that you're going to get asked as a teacher is, "What are you doing to challenge my kid?" Right? And the answer can't or shouldn't be just, "Well, I give them more work." I'm giving them different context clues, and providing that, I think, could also, as I'm hearing you talk, really ramp up and get more engagement from stakeholders, parent community, but also shed a light on the true academic rigor that's happening in the classroom, not just a completion of tasks.
Yeah, right. And the one thing I would add is, I think thinking about these levels as the types of questions you ask and the types of questions students are answering. So often when I'm going into a classroom, even on a Zoom call, I'm listening to the questions students are trying to answer and solve. And so at surface, I'm almost always hearing like what and how questions, like, what is the revolution? How did the revolution get started? The deep level questions are like, why is the revolution important? Why do we continue to see revolutions today, as opposed to the American Revolution that we were looking at, earlier? And then transfer is, where do we see revolutions? Should revolutions be used to change governance structures, things of that nature? And so, really, what we want to do, I think, as educators, one way of just thinking of framing this is like, what questions am I asking? What questions am I having students answer? And then what's the best sequence to do that with students? Do I start with the what and how, or do I start with the why? Like, why did Picasso create Guernica? Why did he paint that? Right? And then you can move into the Spanish Revolution, or, why do we have this solution? And you start with a number talk, and you start with a solution, and then you move your way back into, let's learn the procedures behind this, and then let's apply, right? There's so many different ways you can mix it up. I think the key is to make sure that when we're listening to students, that it's not 90% surface and then 10% deep and transfer. And it's not 90% skill and 10% knowledge. It really should be, I think in elementary school, it really should be more of like a 60-40. And then I think as you get into high school, I think that percentage change where we're privileging more of that deep to transfer, because that surface level knowledge has been nurtured and developed.
So, great conversation so far. There's a couple of questions that came in the chat, and I'm actually going to do them out of order because I think it segues into kind of the conversation we have. So. You won't know until you re-look and re-watch this whole thing, which I'm sure you're going to do later on tonight. So the first one goes back to that switching context, and then we'll get into the follow-up questions on exemplars and rubrics. So the first one is, and because it was something I was thinking about, again, those cruisers, right? Those are the ones who are usually used to being well and successful in school. It's pretty easy to complete the task and they're good. But when you start adding these cliffhangers, these twists, these different lenses, as people, as you mentioned, perceive as more work, which is not as different work, how would you help parents understand the frustration experienced by students around that work?
Yeah, so I think a big part of transfer, just number one, is being able to handle frustration. So I really, in the book, I kind of lay out what I think are like 3 kind of essential skills for transfer. So one is around this idea of activation, like, how am I proactive when I don't know what to do? So, because I mean, like right now, I'm a superintendent of a school district, and I'm trying to figure out, like, how do I handle a situation that really is unfolding before my eyes, right? Like, how do I not get mired by that? And how do I really handle this more in a proactive way? And so in the book, we talk a little bit about, like, how do you support students to navigate this learning situation, this learning pit, this learning challenge that they have. And I think now we need to have students doing that, especially cruisers, because at some point rigor is going to come knocking for them. And I'd rather them have to handle that now when they're with me than when they're in college or in the workplace. And they're like, you know what, I'm going to quit because I used to be really good at this and now I'm not. It's just that they're now facing a challenge. And so I think one thing to do, I think, to prepare parents for this, I think if I first, I would write a letter to parents, and on my back to school night, I would say, my job is to make sure that all students get more than 1 year's growth in 1 year's time. That's really what I'm trying to do from an academic level in these 3 levels. And I want them to be able to talk about that as well. And when I see that students are stalling, where they've kind of met this, they've reached a point where they're kind of coasting or cruising, I'm going to throw some challenging situations at them. It's not going to affect their grade. I'm not going to take something away from them, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give them different work that will be challenging. And you're going to hear from them. They're going to say, this is hard. This is different. This student over here doesn't have to do that. But what it does is it really puts them into this situation that they need, not only for transfer, but to also to be able to handle the struggles of academic and just life that many of the other students in that classroom are facing and are handling. And I think that one of the things is that these aren't big things. They're little tiny shifts that we're talking about. Like if I was teaching a physics class, I might go to these two students and say, hey, you don't get to ignore air resistance. Or hey, gravity isn't a constant for you. Now that's hard, but I'm not saying like you have to do a whole new independent project. You know, to me, this is differentiation that's practical. Hey, I'm going to come up with a couple bumps in the road for you that are going to help you in your learning. And I still love you. Like I'm going to care for you and you have these bumps in the road. And I'm doing this now so that later on in life, when you face like a pandemic, you'll be like, you know what? I remember when McDowell used to throw these curveballs at me, like I could probably navigate my way through that. So that's that activation piece. The second piece around the skill, just to get it, is that notion of application. I can apply across multiple situations. And then the last one is authenticity. And like, I can engage with people that are actually doing this work and living through these experiences. I think when you do those three things, you just move people to transfer. And again, I think a big part of this book is that I know teachers are time poor. And in this situation, even more so. And so I'm trying to say like this is kind of what it means. And here are some little tiny shifts that you can put into place that I think can really move the needle at a level of teaching and learning that, you know, I spent a lot of time on, but I wasn't really taught much about transfer when I went through college and even going through innovative schools.
So it's, you know, really making sure I think about those kids. It's also, it sounds like there needs to be a good foundation of relationship building between teacher and student, knowing your students and building a culture that this is a classroom of learning and that there's going to be these bumps in the road. And we do that because I care for you. And to care for you means my job here is to cause you to learn, right?
Right.
Just,
right.
And unapologetically, some would say.
Yeah. And what I would say too, and I think this will probably get into some of those questions around Hattie's work, is, you know, one of the key reasons why I like this language, and I think when you just said culture, and I want to just show a couple of videos, is that one thing that I'm really drawn by, that I think we missed the boat a bit on some of the innovative work, is giving students the tools and the strategies to actually own their own learning. I think we kind of assumed like, all right, you get it. You now have ownership over your own learning. They're like, what? Great. I can't even put my room together. Like, what do you mean? It's like, no, you get to own your own learning and you get to work in a group of 3 other people. It's like, what? You know, and I think that and then we created this culture of like, no, you have the power. But what we didn't do is actually give them tools to actually empower themselves. And so I think where Professor Hattie's work was so influential to me was in these schools that really taught students how to talk about their learning and to own their own learning. And his work, you know, the book is called Visible Learning. The research basis is visible learning. Really, it starts before that. Really, the prequel to this was, I think Professor Hattie was really influenced by Graham Nuttall's work on the hidden lives of learners, where they put little lapel mics on students, well, lapels, and like listen to them speak for 5 years. And what they found is that 80% of the classroom's hidden, 80% of the feedback kids give and receive are from their friends, and 80% of that is wrong. And so how do you make that classroom visible? How do you make sure that kids who are going to talk to each other regardless actually give each other accurate feedback? And so I want to show just 2 quick clips of how students talk about deep and transfer level learning. I think it's an important part of culture and why that's critical to creating an atmosphere where you can actually develop rigor and students will take charge of that. So,
and before you hit play there, Michael, I'm going to time check us a little bit. I know we started late, so we're going to go about 15 minutes after the hour. And we'll leave the last like kind of 5 minutes for just kind of closings. And after these clips, we have 3 questions in waiting for you.
All right, I'm going fast, Aaron. I'm trying.
I know you are. I know. We just get too excited about it.
All right. So this is a school. This is a school just right outside of Sydney, Santa Sophia. And what they've done, actually, I want to show this other slide first. So let me pull this up. What they've done is they've really taken this language to heart. And so they've created these spaces that one space is for surface, one space is for deep, one space is for transfer, and to really help students be able to have a language to talk about this. Now, in the visible learning literature, students that are assessment capable and can really talk about their learning, where they're going, where they are, what's next, at these levels of complexity, it yields like 2 to 3 years of academic growth. I mean, this is a place we should be investing our time. And I just want us to listen in on how these students are starting to internalize this language and then use it to develop that level of rigor we want to see. So we're going to listen to some students talk about deep. It's a really short clip, and then we'll talk about transfer. And then I just want to unpack that quickly, and then we'll get to the questions in the queue. All right.
It's deep because we've already built the knowledge. We're not at surface anymore because we already know what we need to do. Whereas deep, we're making the meaning because we're actually attempting the task, getting more information, and presenting our knowledge to our peers for feedback.
Yeah, so such as the body systems, we first had to identify each of them, like the circulatory, excretory, all those, and then we started to compare and contrast them. What would happen if once something's happened to one of them, will something happen to all the others then? And then once we did that, we then had a scenario given to us by the teacher. Say you have started to lose oxygen in your spaceship, what systems would be affected then? So we have the knowledge from what specific systems there are, how they each affect each other, and then we're given the scenario, and then we gather up all our information that we've had over the lessons and then put it into that scenario.
So in this particular clip, right on that other piece of glass, like behind her, they're all trying to identify like the different systems of the body, right? Like the respiratory system, the cardiovascular system, all of that. And here, what they're trying to do is really start to develop an enduring understanding around homeostasis and balance. And then in that next kind of pod that they're in, they're talking about transfer. So let's just take a listen in really quick.
And we're also allowed, we can apply apply our knowledge in new situations. So right now we were doing another poster on how the excretory system is affected in space. So we can use the knowledge of the other poster for that one.
And so here, they're taking that knowledge around the body systems, and then they're saying, well, how would that apply if we were up in space, or if we were deep underwater? And so they can start to compare and contrast. And so I think that's a really big part of the visible learning work. And it's incredibly influential in terms of my thinking and what we need to do in terms of instruction, is that rigor is the equal intensity of all three of these things, and students need to be a part of that conversation. And I think if we can build those things, we will really have students getting that level of growth we want. All right, let's go to the questions.
Yeah, well, I'll do my educational term, piggyback off of that statement. Check for all those playing bingo at home. One of these things I think about, the indicators and the clarity just in the classroom. When I watch videos anymore, I just love watching what's going on in the background, right? Like not necessarily with students, but what's on the wall. And I love that teacher or that school has the indicator underneath that I can apply this in different situations, right? So if you get those that all teachers worry about, the early finishers, the cruisers, can they do that? And that's just a steadfast piece in terms of how they're applying their work is a beautiful, well done. Okay, questions, here we go. All the way back, Lori Boswell has been so patient. Thank you, Lori. Could you talk a little bit about the use of exemplars versus rubrics?
Yeah, of course. So if everyone on this call was taking a graduate class with me, and I'm like, you're going to write a paper for me, and I gave you like a 2-page rubric, I bet half of you would say, can you send me an example of what you want? Like, you'd want to see what I'm after. You'd want to see what success looks like. So most humans want a concrete example of what we're after. And often when we design rubrics and we say, here are the 10 things that I want to see, we have to remember that a novice doesn't know what those 10 things are. So they see that tool and they're like, okay, but I don't know what those are. I mean, everyone on this call, if I gave you a rubric for effective teaching, you'd be like, yeah, that makes sense. Effective classroom management, clear learning intentions, like those things would make sense. If I'm like, here's a rubric of how to build a space shuttle, you'd be like, yeah, I need to see like examples, and can you walk me through it? So I think a big part of, like, when we think of rubrics and we think of examples, we need to really think about, it's about children being clear on what we're after. and clarity is never, unilateral. It's never like, here's what you're going to do and here's a rubric. That's unilateral. It is actually has to be interactive. There has to be a struggle. So I think instead of saying, here's your rubric and this is clarity, and it doesn't matter, you could like sing the learning intentions in a conga line. Like they're not going to learn. Like they're going to be like, okay, whatever. But if you start to say to students, here are 3 papers, I want you to read these and I want you to tell me what you think we're learning and what are similar and different between these. Students start to debate and discuss, like, all right, I think we're probably learning how to like write a personal narrative, maybe a personal narrative. I don't know, writing a scary story. And then what I can do is to say, we're not learning how to write a scary story, because you can see this is a scary story and this is going on a field trip. And so that's all the context. Now, what's similar between all of these, and then building out the rubric together. So what do you think makes these things successful? And they're like, well, it has a beginning, middle, and end. I'm like, all right, well, that's a start, right? And so we write that out, and they're like, all right, well, it has comparing connectives or contrasting connectives. It uses personal pronouns, and we start writing those things on the board or putting those up on our Google Doc and saying, yeah, it has those types of things. And then what happens is that as the students start to build the rubric with us using successful examples, they are more likely to be able to give each other effective feedback. To start to say, when they look at someone else's paper, be like, you know what, you're missing this, or you have this. My strongest suggestion to do this and also teach transfer is to make sure you show kids examples in multiple contexts. Don't just show them a personal narrative that's a scary story, because what's going to happen, and they're going to copy that. They're going to be like, all right, I'm just going to write a scary story just like this. So if you're going to only show them one example, then say, you can use this example, but the only thing you can't write is a scary story. And that starts to get kids to be like, whoa.
So I can't use data in one pandemic. I should use multiple pandemics when looking at data.
Right, totally.
Okay. But I love that idea, like going back to my PBL lens, right? Like I think about what you just described is really the perfect project launch. I don't have to trick kids over context anymore. I can get them engaged on the front end around what the content and what quality looks like to hook them in. So it's a double whammy there in a very positive way.
Yeah, I think the people on the call that are really into PBL, like, there's this idea of like, you have a really clear entry event, and then you give them the rubric, and then you put them in, they do no's and needs and no's, and then you put them into groups, and it's very structured. And then we've been trained,
Michael, right. We've been PBL trained. That's what we do. Yeah.
And then there's this myth, like, and then there's a messy middle where it's like, then they like somehow learn the content. And then it's a very structured end where it's like, everyone does a PowerPoint. And what I would say is flip that. The beginning and the end are a bit messy. Like think about the environmental racism one that I talked about, where it's like, you got multiple situations. What do you think is the overall question that we might be after? Help me build the rubric. Let's look at some examples. That part's messy. And then it's like, all right, I'm going to actually teach you some stuff. And I'm going to use, those great strategies we've learned, like with using direct instruction is just fine. Like I'm going to do some modeling, some guided practice. We're going to do some independent practice. Like all of that's great. And the middle is a bit more structured. And then at the end, you might have different ways of presenting the projects or the answers to your transfer question. You might give some students little curveballs and say, well, you have to deal with this situation. You have this, and you've got to add that. And so when they're presenting to each other, to the whole class, it's different. It's a bit novel. And then what I do is, as the students are listening in, I might say, let's say that every single student group was like working on a different context, I might say that the overall end assessment is, how do they all relate? That's transfer. And that helps kids with breadth, because it's this cognitive flexibility between, I got to focus in, I got to look out.
Great. So I'm going to keep going down. We got another 2 questions here. Next one is going to be, how do we support teachers who may be reluctant in creating or doing activities that may target transfer learning? And how can we equip them with that skill?
Yeah, so here's the thing I would say to start with is that, so I'd probably look at 2 things. So the first is that there's a really good chance that they are already doing some transfer things, but they're not naming it that way, and they're not doing it at the time when they need to transfer. So for example, like most teachers don't show kids just one thing. Like it's usually not just like, here's a scary story and all we're going to do is look at one scenario the whole time. They actually do show other things. But what they don't ask students to do is to say, compare. How are they similar? How are they different? So I think the first thing to do with any teacher that you're thinking, all right, how do I engage them in this, is find out what they're already doing and say, how can we maybe change a few things of what you're already doing, as opposed to saying, you got to do all this brand new stuff, especially right now.
Yeah.
Right. Like I think that that would be key. And I think the second thing that my mantra is always this: you're doing great things as a teacher. It is a question of whether kids are with you when you're doing those great things. So how can you get students to name the levels of learning that they're at? So when you say, well, this task is surface, or this task is deep, or this task is transfer, how do you get students to name that? Like, oh, that's a surface level task, and this is where I am in my learning. So I think flipping it to say, look, I'm not here to attack your teaching. I'm actually here to talk about student learning. And so let's talk about that, because remember, 80% of what's happening in the classroom, the teacher can't see, like regardless of what we think about. So if we can get students to start talking about it, we can actually visualize that a bit more. So I would say, what are they already doing? And saying, all right, well, look, you're talking about this context here, and then one at the end, bring them together and talk about similarities and differences. And then the second is, how do you make sure kids are with you when you're doing great things? How can you get them to name the levels of learning? I think that could make monumental shifts. And I think teachers will be with you if you present those types of ideas to them.
All right, next question. I think I'm going to try and squeeze a third one in here, another one in after this, because that's just how we're going to do it. How would you encourage transfer level verbs in certain areas or grades, units, where the level is typically asking them to like recall? So like surface level, they use the words identify or describe. Like what recommendations, like if I'm a content teacher and the majority of my standards are at like the recall level?
So I would say, so like if I'm recalling like certain terms, I might say, so at the deep level, I might look at, can you compare and contrast that term to another term? I might say like hypothesize. Can you critique a piece of writing and say, did they use that verb? Did they use that term appropriately? Have you ever seen that term in a different situation? Or showing them pieces of writing, one might be in English and one might be in social studies, to say, how is that particular term used? Is it used in the same way in both situations? Because again, remember that transfer is fundamentally about comparisons and seeing patterns. And so I think really it's simply, looking at like, let's critique this piece. Let's hypothesize how that could have been used, differently, right? Or something of that nature. I think that would just be something that you can really move to. I think that the key is that in that situation, I think in particular, it's probably more of a deep level problem than how do I get that to transfer? Because I think we can show them multiple situations where a term is used, but I think at the deep, it's kind of like, why? Like, why do we do that? Like, why is that term used? I think is where I probably push that.
Great. Last two questions. Because one snuck one in on the chat. I see it. So we want to make sure we honor the chat. How do we help teachers find value in the uncomfortable silence that comes from the struggle and not feel the need to immediately intervene? Like particularly when asking inquiry type of questions.
Yeah. Wow. Like, how do we make them feel comfortable with that?
How do we help teachers find value in that? Right. So like, we think about the wait time. I'm reflecting just in my own practice of the purposeful use of protocols, of the silence, and building kind of that across the board. But
yeah, I mean, I think it's actually what you just said, Aaron. Like that's immediately what went to my mind, is that probably the best way to do it and to get acclimated to doing it is to use a protocol, like a silent protocol, a chalk talk, a critical friends, a Harkness protocol, like all these various protocols. And so my suggestion there would be, I have a lot of these protocols like in the appendix of the book because it's a big part of deep to transfer level learning, but the National School Reform faculty has like amazing protocols. I really think that often what this requires is structure, to say, let's structure these conversations like at breakout rooms, or so that teachers can say, I've got to sit back and listen. And that's required in this particular protocol, I think is really helpful.
Yeah, I think the protocols and getting teachers comfortable with themselves with silence, whether you model those in some staff meetings or PLC meetings, and then finding that value and reflecting in that as well.
And let me just add to that, because I think that's, and I think what's important for the people on this call, they're like, I support and help other teachers, is you have to model that first. Mm-hmm. And I think if you can do like even a video with a couple of other teachers, kind of like what we're doing here, like as a fishbowl, and record it, and then show that and say, what do you notice about this? What do you notice about the teacher? What are they doing? What happens when someone was stuck? What happens when they said something incorrect? What happens when they said something inappropriate? Like whatever, like how did I respond to that? And what are some of your takeaways? And then saying, let's go and do that in your own classroom. I think could be really powerful. So use kind of a video fishbowl.
Great. So we have about 5 minutes left. So we'll finish on this question and we'll give it over for you for some final thoughts. So right now we're currently in the middle of a pandemic. I don't know if you've been watching news, but something's going on with a million things on your mind, on our mind. I mean, I know like even for us as a school, getting back to school, the logistics, distance learning, why would someone want to engage in this work, teaching for transfer?
Well, I think number one, I think this is ultimately what we are after as educators. I think ultimately what we want children to know and be able to do from school is to be able to apply what they're learning into their life when they graduate school, as well as applying that on the weekends or when they're in a difficult situation at home or in social situations to say, the things my teachers taught me, how do I apply those things? And so I think ultimately, like, this is the perfect situation to say, if that's my number one goal, okay, I want to start to invest in this. I mean, I will tell you, Aaron, like this is the longest it's ever taken me to write a book, because there's not many books out there on like, how do you teach to transfer? There's a lot of things on like struggling readers, but there's not much here, right? So I think it's this idea of like, how do we invest? And I think you named the other one. We're facing multiple pandemics. A pandemic associated with institutional racism, a pandemic associated with microbiology, a pandemic of climate change. And what we really need right now are people that know things and can apply them into new situations. And I think that level of cognitive flexibility, I think it's incumbent upon us to say, how can I put some of those things into place that are practical and doable for me as a practitioner, but to get our students a few more of those tools in order to do it? Because one, that's what we've always wanted. And number two, there's never been, I think, a more pressing time, at least in my life, where I haven't looked out and said, gosh, this is really what we need right now, are experts that are also, that have depth, but also range of knowledge and skills.
Great. Well, I know before we close out, I know that reading the book, not only the first time, but the second time, I do think, no offense to your other books, but it is one of your better books, just because I think it speaks too much. It speaks so much of like, to me as a teacher and what I want. I think like I got into PBL to show kids how to apply knowledge, but it was always in that one situation. And we know the world is continually changing. And so to be able to transfer that into different contexts, as well as on the planning side, it was extremely freeing to see the simplicity and the clarity around that, and the voice that we can still give to students without sacrificing what I want. I didn't have to spend hours planning around building something or prototyping or designing. It was really about how can kids apply. And personally, as we're moving into distance learning virtually, I see it extremely applicable to today. How do we help give that voice and choice to kids about, because we know their environments, there's access issues. It's more about how can you apply it in different situations. So I think it's extremely applicable in today's climate and environment. With that, I'll give you the final word and then I'll close this out.
Well, thank you, Aaron. And thanks everybody for being on the call today. What I would say just to end is that if you decide to take a look at this or to engage in this journey and to go down this route of like, these are some of the things I really want to focus on with my learners, and these are some things I'm going to take a calculated risk on in my classroom or in my school, please reach out. Let me know. I'm happy to jump on a Zoom call with you. I'm happy if you're going to do a book study, I'm happy to jump in as you're wrestling through with one of the ideas, and we can think through it together. I would like everyone on this call to know I'm a practitioner. I'm practicing right now. And so I'm continuing to learn and continuing to grow in this particular work as well. And I'd love to hear your feedback on like things that you did in the class that worked well, things that you're like, all right, I'm trying this and this is what's happening. And any feedback that you want to provide to me, I'd be happy to take it, whether it's a critique or something that worked really well. We do have a website that we've launched, Hinge Education. And .org. So you can go on there. You can go to at Hinge Education, our Twitter handle, and follow us or send things out as you're going through that. Love to be a part of that conversation with you as we do this work. I think that this is really exciting work. I think that this is the book that I would say really comes to the search for me over the last 20 years of what I've been trying to do in education, of like, how do I actually teach transfer that seems reasonable and practical, like I can do it, and seems to really make that impact. It has, as Jay McTighe, he wrote the foreword of the book, said it has that balance between it doesn't sound ivory tower, but it doesn't water it down. And so that's always a good thing. But I appreciate your time tonight. I hope it was helpful. And please feel free to send me an emails if you're like, I'd like to see some more of this. I'd like to see a template. We try to make all of our templates one pagers, super simple to integrate classes, to come up with different context. Happy to help. And Aaron, thanks so much for running this today.
Not a problem. Well, Michael, thank you for your time. In the chat, for those of you, I've also put links to the 3 Twitter handles that Michael referenced, as well as a link to the website where you can find out more. Michael, thank you very much for your time today. Really appreciate, always enjoy a good Q&A. For those of you all attending, thank you very much. Depending on when you're at, have a great rest of the day. And hopefully we'll see you guys soon. Have a great one. Thank you all.
Take care.